So good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to our final town hall session of the day. I'm Traci Lang. I'm the Associate Director at the Joint Review Committee on Education and Radiologic Technology, and I will be your moderator. Thank you for joining us and to listen in on these important updates from our Chief Executive Officer. I'd like to start with a few housekeeping items. All participants will be muted during the presentation. The chat feature will only be utilized for questions, so please ask any questions that you may have in the Ask Questions Here box. These questions will then be addressed to Leslie at the end of her presentation. If you submit a question that is not answered during the session, then an individual response will be sent to you. If you have any additional questions, please contact the office. We're also going to do an electronic consent notification. Please be advised that the JRCERT is recording this town hall session for upload to YouTube. As such, if you choose to unmute yourself during the webinar, your voice will be heard during this recording. And so without hesitation, I will turn it over to our fearless leader, Ms. Leslie Winter.
Thanks, Trace. Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the JRCRT board and staff, I'd like to introduce Jason Melcarrick. Jason's an accreditation assistant. He does the Pulse for us, the newsletter Pulse, and he also is responsible for the quality improvement plan in the office, among other things, and his accreditation work, of course. And then Tracy. I always want to give a shout out to Tracy because this past year has been quite the challenge for us as far as site visits. Tracy's in charge of site visits, overseeing the site visit process. So she gets 5 scheduled and then she gets 5 canceled. So it's been quite a challenging year for her, but we've managed to stay afloat and are head above the water, and she's done a great job. So first, I'd like to start off with a COVID update and let you know where we are as an organization. The JRCRT continues to work remotely. I'm hoping that we can return to the office after the Labor Day weekend. It just depends where Chicago is and what the environment's like downtown. So we're keeping that on our radar. Obviously, we continue to offer a timely and effective accreditation process. So we also continue to afford programs the opportunity to be creative and flexible in their clinical scheduling, so that students have the ability to matriculate through the program. We also support early release if those students are clinically competent, they've done all their clinical competencies and their didactic requirements. We do suggest, though, if you have the ability to early release, you may want to check with your institutional policies, and sometimes state regulations have a play in that. You know, students at the state have to have so many hours to complete. So those are just some of the things you want to keep in mind if you're gonna, you know, have an early release policy. The other thing is that, you know, we are allowing the flexibility and creativity of scheduling your students clinically. We do ask that, you know, the assignments must be educationally valid and those students must be appropriately supervised in the clinical setting. The JRCRT is allowing programs to utilize distance education without approval from the JRCRT through fall semester. We're going to go ahead and evaluate the environment probably late summer to determine if we're going to continue that, if it's still going to be applicable for spring 2002. So as soon as we know more, we'll let you know more. We're also in the beginning stages of updating the accreditation portal, so that's exciting news. It's going to be much more user-friendly and efficient. You'll have the ability to utilize a spell check in the portal when you're doing a self-study or an interim report, indent, bold, put in hyperlinks, all those things that you cannot do now. So we're excited about that. We anticipate it to be ready late fall of this year. So that's exciting news for us too. Just a reminder, folks, when you're applying for clinical education settings in the portal, when you're through with the recognition, the application, you have to scroll down, and way on the bottom, there's a submit button. If you do not submit it to the office, it's going to be floating around in cyberspace. So you have to submit it so the office can accept it and process the request. We've been pretty timely and efficient on recognizing clinical settings because we realize that, you know, with COVID, you need to get settings quickly. So we're aware of that. Let's talk about the 2020 program effectiveness data, because that has had a lot of conversation over the previous town halls today. The annual reports are expected to go out early July. At this time, we have not determined if there's going to be any exceptions for not meeting benchmarks due to COVID. We need to see the data in the office before we make any exceptions. So if you're not meeting benchmarks due to COVID, make sure that it's documented, that you've analyzed the data, you've shared it, and you've documented it. You know, our board is made up of 7 program directors, so they know the issues because they're going through the same thing. So as soon as that data starts coming into the office and we analyze it, we'll see where we are with it and determine if there's going to be any exceptions to it. Same thing with your assessment plan. We suspect that there's probably be holes within the assessment plan or data missing because you may have had to go into the clinical. That's maybe where you are assessing some of your outcomes. So we realize that. Make sure, again, if that's the case, that you identify it in meeting minutes, that you were not able to access the data. When filling out your annual report for program completion rate, please utilize the definition that's identified in the 2021 standards. That is, any student that leaves your program due to non-academic reasons, you do not have to count. So if they have left your program due to any health reason or medical reasons, that type of thing, you do not have to count them. So if you start with 10 students and 1 leaves because they don't like the profession, you have 9 students. If those 9 students graduate, your completion rate is 100%. So we're hoping that caveat helps as far as retention. And again, any unmet benchmarks, including program completion rate that you don't meet, make sure that you discuss it when you're analyzing your data. Let's talk about the website compliance checklist a little bit, because if you're a program director, you received that email back in March from me regarding the website compliance. So the standards incorporate a lot of regulations that come down to us from the United States Department of Education, or CHIA, which is the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. And those regulations require that our standards demonstrate public accountability and transparency. So with that being said, we have to assure that your websites have accurate and current information on them. So if you go to Standard 1, Objective 1.1, there's a list of information that must be on your website or your institution's website. That's 1.1 and 1.6, which is the program effectiveness data. So let's talk about 1.1 first. 1.1 has a laundry list of items that must be on, like I said, your institution or the program's website. One of those is your mission statement, goals, and student learning outcomes. They need to be on your homepage. They can be directly on your homepage, or you can have a link to them. If you use a link to these things that are required on your homepage, please make sure that they're labeled clearly. Because you gotta remember who's looking at your homepage. It's prospective students, so it needs to be clear and accurate. The other thing that needs to be on your homepage or a link to it is that you're accredited by us. you're accredited by the JRCERT, blah, 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 20 North Wacker, the phone number and the email. And then you must display your accreditation status, the length of your accreditation, 8 years, 5 years. Again, that needs to be on your homepage or a link to that verbiage. The next thing is articulation agreements. Although they don't need to be on the homepage, there's been a lot of confusion about an articulation agreement versus an affiliation agreement. An affiliation agreement is what you use with your clinical settings. Those don't need to be on your webpage. An articulation agreement, if you have an articulation agreement, needs to be on your homepage. Now, that articulation agreement is an agreement with another post-secondary institution to allow students to transfer to that institution to get a higher degree. So if you're a community college, you may have an articulation agreement with a university that provides them the opportunity to achieve a baccalaureate degree. All you need to do on your webpage is say that you have that articulation agreement with that university or whoever, okay? And the other one that was causing some confusion was that you have to have clinical obligations on your homepage. What's clinical obligations? Well, that's any fees that you have for background or drug screening. If the student has to travel to geographically dispersed settings, and we consider anything geographically dispersed as more than 60 miles. And if your students have to do weekends or evening assignments. Now, the weekends and evening assignments, you don't have to say they have to do X weekend assignments, just that that's a requirement for the program, weekends and evenings. We've had a lot of questions about the standards, the 2021 standards. I just want to highlight some of the things that have come across the office for you folks. First of all, if you go on our website under accreditation information and click on the standards, there's 2 standard groups there. There's a group of standards that are in a flipbook version. It's a software called Flipbooks that we utilize. And then there's the traditional PDF version of the standards. In the flipbook version, if you go to things that are underlined, words that are underlined and hover over it, resources are going to come up for you. So if you haven't checked it out, you need to check it out because it's a really cool document and staff has done a lot of work with it. So if you hover over meeting minutes, samples of meeting minutes will come up for you to utilize. If you hover over a contingency plan, a sample of a contingency plan will come up. If you hover over assessment plans, an assessment plan will come up for you to use. So this document is a pretty fluid document because we continue to add resources as we find really good resources through self-studies and whatnot. So check that out. The PDF though, if you go into the PDF and you, there's words that are underlined. If you click on that, it'll take you to the glossary for the definition. So there's no resources embedded in the PDF. So the Flipbooks is really a good resource for you. Some of the other questions that we've gotten about record retentions and what do you need to keep for your students. And really the only requirement for record retentions that we have is a final transcript. Anything else you folks want to keep is totally up to you. It's your prerogative. If you want to keep clinical records, you know, the clinical competency forms or attendance forms, that's totally up to you. Our only requirement is the transcript. And if you're at a university or a community college, that's not, you know, usually an issue. But you also want to check with your institution if they have a record retention policy. Some institutions have a record retention policy. So you want to check that out to see if there's certain records that you have to keep. We've also had a number of questions regarding guidelines for weekend and evening rotations. You know, when the board revised the standards, they determined that, you know, weekend and evening rotations are extremely valuable, and we shouldn't have such caveats on those assignments. We shouldn't have restrictions. So they did away with that 25% rule. Back in the 2014 standards, only 25% of your total clinical hours could be weekends and evenings. So they've done away with that because they feel they're valuable. But what you need to be assured is that they're educationally valid. And if they link to something special, like if you say you're doing evenings or weekends because of trauma, then you need to determine, you know, when those students go to that assignment. You know, is it appropriate to have a first year go the first semester? I don't know. That's up to you to determine. You do not necessarily need objectives for those rotations anymore. You're more than welcome to develop objectives to support the rotations, but we're not going to be looking for specific objectives for evening and weekends rotations anymore. Also for clinical assignments, one of the things that we did for clinical assignments, it used to say that didactic and clinical could not exceed 40 hours per week. We deleted the didactic, and we deleted the 40 hours per week. And now clinical assignments can't be no more than 10 hours a day. Obviously, if the student does more than 10 hours a day, it needs to be voluntary on their part. And you need to be careful, because more than 10 hours a day, you need to be assured that, you know, patient care is not being compromised. And then the last one I want to talk about here with you in the standards is the supervision objective. We took the 3 previous objectives in the old standards and put them into one. So the direct supervision, the indirect supervision, and the repeat are all in one objective, and that's 5.4. What we also did here is that we put in verbiage to assure that not only students and clinical preceptors are cognizant of the policy, but clinical staff. So, and then we took, obviously, we no longer use the term clinical instructors. Everyone is a clinical preceptor. The next thing that we get a lot of questions in the office are faculty designation appointments. How do we use those in the office? So the first one is the acting appointment. The acting appointment is identified when the program official lacks one or more of the qualifications as identified in the standards, but can meet those qualifications in 1 year. So if you're applying for a program director appointment and you lack, let's just say, advising, we'd probably identify you as acting, because that could be easily accomplished in 1 year. At the end of that year, we would ask you what you've done in support to achieve that through a progress report. So that's acting. The other one, except for degree requirements, if you're applying for a program director position and you don't have a master's degree, if you can show us that you're enrolled in a graduate program, we'll allow you that acting capacity for 2 years, as long as you're making progress towards attaining that master's degree. And that's the same thing for clinical coordinator. You know, if you need to hire a clinical coordinator, they don't have a baccalaureate degree. If they're enrolled in a program to achieve that baccalaureate degree, we can identify them as acting for 2 years. The other one is an interim appointment. An interim appointment is typically when the program official is absent, such as maybe for health reasons, they take a leave of absence, or maternity leave or something like that. So typically the interim appointment is only really kind of temporary. It's good for 1 year until the permanent program official comes back into that capacity. And the last one is a temporary appointment. A temporary appointment, it cannot meet the qualifications in the standards within 1 year. So if the program director leaves, sometimes the dean takes over as temporary while the institution does a search for a permanent program director. So those are the three that we typically use in the office. And the last thing I would like to talk about, a few things. The website is we're in the process of getting it updated, so we're excited about that. The learning management system, we continue to put in modules, develop modules for that. So you need to keep your eyes open, need to go on our web periodically, and we have a lot of valuable resources out there. But I really think the best resource you guys can possibly have is the staff. The staff is really always willing to help out. You know, even though we're working remotely, our lines of communication are fully open. Call the office and it get routed to a professional staff, or email the staff. If you can't find our emails, if you go on about JRC and click on staff, you'll see all of our beautiful faces there with our emails. So, you know, I encourage you, if you need some help, to reach out to a staff member. And do we have any site visitors out there in this virtual world? John, yes, we do. I just want to thank you all for your dedication and commitment to the process, because it has been one crazy year. So I am happy to answer any questions you folks have.
So as a reminder, please put the questions in through the Ask Questions Here box. There will be a time for open questions at the end. Let's all ask a question in relation to the program effectiveness data template. Does the actual template have to be on the website, or may it be a PDF link?
You can do either if you're going to use that template on the website, or utilize a link with it.
Okay, and a follow-up question to that, is this the way the JRCERT expects programs to update their program effectiveness data each year?
Yes, we do. The template, and I'll give you a little history, it was in the broadcast email, but you know, we had to, just like you folks, do an interim report for CHIA. And in that report, we had to send them all of your website homepage links. And they went on your websites and checked for program effectiveness data. And they came back to us and said, we found your program's program effectiveness data, but it's very inconsistently reported. And they didn't think that that was very transparent to the general public. So that's how the template came about.
Thank you for that background information. Here's another question. I recently submitted our program self-study in preparation for an expected fall site visit. In the last town hall session, the plan for site visits entailed one virtual site visitor and one in-person site visitor. Is this still the expected plan for fall of 2021?
Yeah, and we don't know that answer yet until it gets a little closer, what the environment looks like and where that program is. And, you know, are there institutional travel restrictions? Are there state travel restrictions? If there are, we do have that ability to perform a hybrid site visit where one individual is on campus and one is virtual. Obviously, we would try to do the traditional site visit because it's more efficient than having someone virtual and having someone on campus, but we can go ahead and perform the hybrid site visit. Traci monitors the state restrictions and reaches out to program directors on a daily basis to see where they are institutional-wise, and then make that call as it gets a little closer to your scheduled site visit. The Department of Education said we could do a true virtual site visit where both site visitors are on are virtual. That's good, duh. So, but the department also said if you perform a virtual site visit, there's a caveat to that, and that is as soon as it is safe to do so, you have to do a traditional site visit. That means we're on campus. So we just don't believe it's a very good use of human and or physical resources to give you one site visit stressful enough. Let's do 2. So yeah.
Thank you, Les. Here's a question back to objective 1.1. Could you please elaborate on the content which should be included in the program's contingency plan?
Sure, and every institution, every program is a little different, and a lot of that depends, where you may be located. There is an article that I wrote in the Pulse, the Spring 2020 Pulse. It's called Lessons Learned. We've learned a lot of lessons, that's for sure. That might help give you some ideas of a contingency plan. All of our Pulse newsletters are archived on our website under accreditation information, so you can take a look at that. But when we were developing our contingency plan, there were some things that I thought were really important. And one was communication. I think it's critical that you have a plan to communicate with your staff, your students, faculty. How are you going to communicate? When are you going to communicate with them? Our office teams every morning at 9 o'clock. And it's not only just a mental health check-in, but, we talk accreditation jive. It's really exciting, our team's conversation. But it's also to make sure that my staff are okay and doing well. The other thing that is on our contingency plan is, did staff, or not only did they, but do they have the technology to work remotely? So even though we can access the accreditation management system remotely, do they have the tools they need to work efficiently? And then the one we just got back through talking about is, how do you return safely? What are you going to require your staff or employees to do? Are you going to require them to have temperature checks? What are you going to require the students to do when they're in lab? Are they going to, be limited to a small number of students? Who's going to clean the table? Who's going to do this? All of those things. So you may also want to check with your institution to see if they have an institutional contingency plan, which may help you drive your programmatic contingency plan.
Thank you for that. Charlotte is an eager beaver. She said that she doesn't see a spring 2021 Pulse newsletter on the website. Is it coming soon?
Oh, hang on. So I'll go under accreditation information, and at the very right under JRCRT news and events, it says JRCRT newsletters, and it is spring 2020. Did I say 2021? It's spring 2021, and you open it up, you'll see, or spring 2020, I'm sorry, and you'll see the beautiful CEO.
Perfect. And then the 2021 will be coming out soon then, correct?
Yes, correct. We're working on it now as we speak.
Great, thank you.
I get my years mixed up. It's been such a, I don't even know if 2021, right?
Right. Can a radiologist supervise a student operating fluoroscopy or C-arm?
No, they cannot. The standards require that it's a qualified practitioner, and we define a qualified practitioner as someone that's credentialed in radiography. Also in the new standards, the 2021 standards, surgery and fluoroscopy require direct supervision by a qualified radiographer.
And thanks, Les. Catherine gave an update that spoke to changes that were made as far as mandatory and elective competencies. So she just wanted to make others aware of that, to go and check out any changes that may be out there for mandatory and elective competencies. Sean has asked that I repeat the last question on who could not supervise students in fluoro.
Yeah, Tracy asked if a radiologist could supervise a student floral, and the answer is no. They need to be directly supervised by a qualified practitioner.
Thank you, Les. Jody would like us to give an update on an energized lab and the requirements for that.
Okay, so we're recommending that you have an energized lab on campus. Here, after 25 years, here's how the standards revision works, okay? So you saw you saw not required, but recommended, just so you know what's gonna happen in the next standards revision. It's like when we went from a baccalaureate degree for a master's degree for a program director, it was baccalaureate degree required, master's degree recommended. Then what happened? You all knew what happened. Then in the next standards revision, you saw a master's degree required, right? So even though we're not requiring an energized lab, it's recommended. You can go off-site for an energized lab. So if you're a community college and you don't have an energized lab, you can use a clinical setting for your energized lab. The problem with that, though, is at times the labs may get interrupted due to patient flow. If that's the case, you need to have some action plan in place so you can make up that lab as soon as possible. Does that answer all of her questions?
Jody, did you need follow through, or does that take care of it for you?
I would suspect in the next standards revision, you're going to see an energized lab is required. I will be retired.
No, you're not, Leslie. No retiring allowed.
So we revised, Jody, was that Jody? We revise the standards every 10 years. So.
Oh, I'll probably be retired then too. Okay. So we do have an off-site clinical site that we use for lab, that if we have one that doesn't interfere with patient flow at all, that there's really no patients at all, and would that be okay, or does it still have to be in the building with the school?
No, absolutely, that would be okay.
Okay, thank you.
So that takes care of the questions that we have thus far. So again, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box there. Or if you'd like to ask Leslie directly, please feel free to do so.
So just to give you guys a heads up, because I had this question at each town hall meeting, our position on the gonadal shielding, and the board discussed it at their April meeting and worked on a position statement, but they weren't quite satisfied with it. So they're meeting actually next week to try to come to a decision and agree upon a position statement. So as soon as that position statement is formalized and adopted by them, well, it'll probably be in the Pulse and also on our web. I can't really discuss their thoughts right now because I don't want to speak on their behalf. So as soon as they vote on something, we're going to get it out there to you guys.
So here is a good question, Les, based off of our conversation on something that's recommended and then later possibly required. So if it's recommended that a program director have a doctoral degree, does that mean eventually they'll be required to do so? And if so, will program directors be grandfathered in?
You know, we did have a grandfather clause way back in the day, and it's really it's really, our attorney says grandfathering isn't probably the best thing to do. You either meet the standards or you don't. I don't know about the PhD requirement. Who posted that, Trace?
Heather.
Okay, I don't know, Heather, you know, how the board will go with that. I think that would be a big step to go from a master's to a PhD, but
She said, thank you, Les.
it's probably not what you wanted to hear. I don't know, but I don't know. So
Tracy's going back to the energized lab question, and she'd like to know, please define energized lab. Does that mean quote unquote tube exposure?
yes, it does. Correct.
So she followed up with, that can be any X-ray room that's available.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So Catherine would like to know, are there any recommendations as to how frequently an energized lab must be utilized to demonstrate, example, on phantoms or performing procedures, exposure type things?
I mean, our standards are that prescriptive, and I think you need to determine that consistent with the curriculum, the ASRT curriculum.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sean would like to know, how's the weather here in Chicago?
It's hot today. It's 84 here today. But tomorrow will probably be 64, so.
This was a kind of a popular conversation item earlier. And before I get to that, I'll ask, do we need site visitors?
Yes, we do need site visitors. We need therapists, we need medical dosimetrists, and we need practitioners. We define a practitioner as someone who either oversees healthcare delivery or takes part in healthcare delivery at least 8 hours a week. And that the practitioner, I mean, your role, if you say, yeah, I'm a practitioner, your role as a site visitor doesn't change. It's not any different. That's a requirement from the Department of Education that we have a practitioner on the team. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Les. What is the JRCERT's stance on COVID vaccinations and how that relates to the students in their programs or clinical experience?
Yeah, that we have had significant conversation today regarding that. You know, and I open up the floor to hear what everybody's requiring, because it's really all over the board. You know, some programs aren't requiring it, other programs are. So you know, if you have a clinical setting that's requiring a vaccination, someone is refusing that vaccination, I mean, you can do the best you can to try to reassign them. If, you know, none of the clinical settings will take the student because they're not vaccinated, I think you've done due diligence with that student, you know. I also suggested in our last town halls that if you're going to require a vaccine, that, you know, you maybe want to talk to your legal counsel. You can't require a vaccine if they have a religious or health reason. They come to you and say, hey, this is against my religion. You can't require the vaccine. So I really strongly suggest that, you know, you have a conversation with your legal department if needed. Part of our contingency plan in the office is that my staff need to be vaccinated with the COVID and they're mandated to get a flu shot, but I have something hanging over their heads. It's called a paycheck. But I had conversation with our legal before I mandated that, because it could be problematic.
back to documentation and retention question, Les. For assessment data and or supervision data, student records, should we maintain that since the time of the last accreditation award?
It's a good question, Trace. So if you're on an 8-year award and you submit in an interim report, the board's going to look at that interim report and they want to be assured that you've maintained compliance with the standards that are required in that interim report since your last site visit. So they're going to look for 4 years worth of assessment data, 4 years of, hey, did you, are you assuring us that the students are cognizant and the clinical staff and clinical preceptors of the supervision policies? When they maintain you, then the program goes back into the continuing accreditation process. So when you have your next site visit, you need to assure the site visit team that yes, we've assessed since the interim report, we've assured supervision policies have been adhered to since the interim report. So you need at least 4 years worth of data.
Thank you for that.
What are your institutions doing as far as the COVID vaccine? Are you requiring your students to get the COVID vaccine?
I saw Rose shaking her head yes.
Yeah, because some of the clinical sites won't let the student in without having been vaccinated, and they have to have fit test as well. So that's their policy. So we have to abide by that.
We do not require it at Indiana University.
We don't require it in Tennessee either.
We don't require it in Georgia, but we do, as you suggest, Leslie, if we tell the student that our ability to place you may be jeopardized if you don't get it.
And that's all, and Lori, that's all you can do, and you've tried to make a reasonable accommodations. And if you can't accommodate the student because they don't want to get the COVID, not the COVID vaccine, no one wants the COVID.
That's the same thing in Maryland too for our program. It's Lori's.
Have you been required to get vaccinated as faculty?
No, they're not requiring faculty or staff to get vaccinated at this point either, even though they've had clinics directly on our campus and offering it to them to make it easier for them.
In Louisiana, they are not required to get the COVID vaccine. Our students were offered that by our sponsoring institution, and we had about half of our student population opt to.
That's just as bad, though.
Okay, guys.
That was the same at our university. The university offered it and the hospitals offered it to our students, but they're not requiring anyone.
Same with us, and interestingly, I'd say at least half of our students, more than half, don't want to get it, which was surprising that they were offered it and more than half denied it. So interesting.
Here in California, we're only strongly recommending they do it. Our faculty have mostly all gotten the vaccine. And the only thing we ran into this year was our application period was with their for their vaccinations, like for Hep B, that they had, some of them had gotten COVID vaccine. So that really threw off our timeline, which we hadn't quite prepared for. So we're ready now, but it was a little chaos.
Yep.
I know this is Joy. In Kentucky, it's not required for the students at this time. They've encouraged everybody, and our sponsoring institution also offered the COVID vaccine to all students. And out of 37, only 3 has been vaccinated. And when I asked the students what was preventing them from getting vaccinated, what I heard was fertility reasons. They're like, we're young, they don't have enough tests, they don't know how it's going to affect fertility.
Okay. Anything else, folks?
Just going to say a few comments from the chat there. Kim said Emory will require it of all their students in the fall. So an opposite point of view there. Nebraska is not requiring. Sarah's gone back to the standards. She has a question regarding clinical staff ratio. So in 2014, it discussed clinical staff ratio of 1:1, and she doesn't see that in the new standards. And I believe Jason is at 4.6.
It's under valid clinical education.
It's 4.4.
Thanks, Jason.
Sorry, thanks, Jay. So where it used to be in 1.3, like we said, it's now in 4.4. So there is still a clinical staff ratio for radiography of 1:1. Well, if there are no other questions, we'll stay on for a few minutes, but don't feel like you're obligated to stay. We thank you so much for taking the time and sending in questions to us and listening to Leslie's presentation and getting information so that we can all do better and be better in education.
And we also thank you for your support of program accreditation, especially during these crazy times. So stay safe, stay healthy, and if you need us, you know where to find us.